So my name is Nima Sanandaji. I'm an international writer and researcher, and I'm going to talk about debunking utopia, exposing the myth of Nordic socialism. Now, this is the title of a book I wrote and was published in the last year in the US election cycle, because as you remember, the idea of Nordic social democracy is pretty hot in the US. And Bernie Sanders and the Democrats were saying, let's transform America into Nordic-style socialist country. And I've written a number of publications on this issue, and it's internationally very hot topic. My perspective is no. Nordic-style socialism is not a very good system. Nordic culture is very good. Nordic experience of free markets is very good and should be admired, but not Nordic socialism. So, does it work? Yeah. Anyway, I've written 25 different books, and 5 of them in this kind of series of the Nordic model. So, Scandinavian unexceptionalism, the Nordic gender equality paradox, debunking utopia, and a couple of others. And these books are surprisingly, they're gaining surprising amount of international attention and very continuous. So, for example, only a few days ago, I did a 1-hour interview with Forbes magazine. So internationally, in the US, in Canada, they're continuously being discussed. But even more in like Poland, Chile, Iran, Korea, many of these countries translate the books. Many of their think tanks and business magazines write about them. And it turns out that the issue of Nordic-style social democracy is, it's kind of discussed in the Nordic countries, but much more in the countries which are not Nordic. And the reason is, just a few of the press sightings. The reason is that the perception of the Nordic model is very strong. The Nordic model is used today internationally as perhaps the number one intellectual argument of the left. The number one intellectual argument of the left is not longer socialism, because that fails. It's not longer Marxism. It's to say, no, let's become a Nordic-style social democratic country. So, and I'm a researcher in technology. So I think, you should systematically break down an issue with facts and figures. And what my writing in these books is about is not an argument that Nordic-style social democracy is not as good as people think, but rather to scientifically, point by point, prove that the success of Nordic countries is not because of the big welfare state, which is, my books are cited by a lot of libertarian and conservative and center-right organizations, of course, but my arguments are not ideological, rather based on fact. And I'm very happy to be here. One reason I came here, besides your wonderful audience and wonderful city, is that so far I've written mostly about Sweden and Denmark in my books. And I'm really, really interested in writing more about Norway. It's a fascinating country, and, but I know much less about Norway than I know about Sweden. So if any of you later tonight during the dinner, for example, has things to tell me, grab me and tell me, because I actually came to learn. But let me just talk about the perception of the Nordic model. Now, the Nordic model has been used for many decades as the main intellectual case for a big government system. So this is, for example, a quote from Times magazine 40 years ago. It's a country whose very name has become a synonym for a materialist paradise. This is how Sweden was described in Times, as a paradise, as a country without poverty, without social ills. And why? Well, of course, social democracy, this magical system. A more recent quote from National Public Radio. Now, National Public Radio is left-leaning, like public media in Norway and Sweden is. And they ran a story about a country that seems to violate the laws of the economic universe. Again, a very popular argument amongst the international left that because Denmark has high taxes and is affluent, this means that we can have very high taxes. It has no effect on the economy because Denmark proves it. And of course, Bernie Sanders, who says, we should learn about Denmark, Sweden, and Norway and introduce their social model. Now, of course, my latest book was written for the American election cycle. And the funny thing is, I don't know, maybe 30 talk show interviews, and of course, the right-wing columnists refer to the book, etc. And it's been discussed a lot on the blogosphere in the US. I've seen it. And really, the left doesn't have any real arguments because their analysis of the Nordic model is very shallow. They just say Nordic countries are good, therefore social democracy is good. They're never contemplating, wait, is social democracy in itself good? When we introduce social democracy in Spain or in California, is it a good model? No. Okay, it doesn't matter, we can become Denmark. And what I say is, yes, Nordic countries are undeniably successful, economically, socially, etc. But why are they successful? We actually have to differentiate what is the cause of success. So let me just briefly go through my theory, of course, just the parts of it. So let's begin with prosperity. Now, I think this is fascinating that already in 1943, Irish historian James Beattie was wondering, why is Denmark so rich? Denmark is interesting here because Denmark was the first Nordic country to kind of embrace industrialism and free markets, right? And in 1943, James Beattie said, Denmark is 50% richer than Ireland. Why is this? Because these two countries are very similar. They have the same agricultural model, they have this quite similar climate, only that Denmark is colder, has less sunlight, has less rain. Ireland is a better country in terms of agriculture, in terms of they have coal, natural resources, etc. Why was Denmark so much more affluent than Ireland? It's a very good question to ask. And James Beattie couldn't say social democracy because, as I'm sure you know, Denmark had a very small government. They almost had a laissez-faire economic model. Low taxes, free markets. So what was the answer? Free markets, social cohesion, and peace. Now, I want you to note that my main thesis, many people think that my main idea is that Nordic countries are prosperous due to free markets. That's just part of my idea. My main idea is that there's a Nordic culture of success. A Nordic culture of success, which is perhaps the best culture of success in the world. And this culture has now, today, in part been destroyed by the welfare state or by the passing of time. But in 1943, the Nordic model of success, hard work, social cohesion, working ethics, highest levels of trust in the world, was very much alive. And that was what James Beattie was pointing to. And after Denmark was early in becoming a market economy in Nordics. Sweden also became a market economy earlier than other Nordic countries. So around 1870, Sweden transitioned towards capitalism. And for a long period, 100 years, Sweden had largely low taxes, small government, laissez-faire, right? It's only at the end of this period, around 1960, when Sweden actually gets high taxes. And the same goes for Norway, but Sweden for 100 years had free market policies. And this is my calculations of growth in Europe. Now you see one of these countries is growing faster than any else, that's Sweden. And second is actually Denmark. So then we move to a more modern age during a time of welfare state expansion, the same countries. And one of them has the lowest growth, Sweden. Just the data doesn't support the idea that social democracy created the prosperity. It didn't. It came during the free market era. As one example, I'm looking at, this is Sweden before the first social democrat government. Sweden had the highest growth rate in the industrialized world, and Denmark similarly had the 6th highest growth rate in the industrial world before their first social democrat government. And after the first social democratic government, these two countries had very mediocre growth. And I'm being very generous in this calculation because, as I'm sure you know, the early social democrats actually preserved the low-tax free market model. It was around the 60-68 era that Nordic countries actually implemented big welfare state, which was not a good idea. We can look at, and some people might say, yes, nobody's claiming that social democracy creates prosperity. It's about creating jobs, right? That's the social democrat model. Well, fine, but you know what? Nordic countries used to be fantastic at one thing before they transitioned to high taxes. You know what that was? Jobs. So this is the Great Depression, and we all remember it as, a long period of stagnation and unemployment. But the reason we remember it that way is that we're obsessed with American media. We're not remembering the Great Depression in the Nordics. We're remembering the Great Depression as shown in Hollywood movies. Because yes, the United States had a very terrible era during the Great Depression. And as I'm sure you know, what happened was the United States introduced a welfare state after the Great Depression and had very stagnant job growth. Now, what many people don't remember is Nordic countries did not introduce a large welfare state following the Great Depression. The Nordic countries chose a free market strategy for getting out of the Great Depression. The government said the market can handle this. And here's unemployment in the 4 Nordic countries during the Great Depression. As you can see, very rapidly unemployment fell. And during the Great Depression, many of the entrepreneurial firms that the Nordic countries are relying on were created. So what happens is that many jobs are lost in these 4 trade-dependent nations. They rely on market forces, and boom, jobs are created. Not through government policy, but through the free market. As an example, we can look at 2 crises in Sweden. So this first crisis is the greatest global crisis in the modern world history, the Great Depression. And I'm showing the number of jobs in the Swedish economy. Now, at a point, Sweden was a low-tax, small government model with a lot of entrepreneurship. You see what happens? Of course, we see the Great Depression. But just a few years after, the number of jobs, so many jobs have been created on the marketplace that Sweden has more jobs than before the Depression hits it. It's a fantastic recovery story. Here's another crisis. This is a crisis in the 1990s. This is a local crisis in Sweden. The world economy is growing. The exports of Swedish companies are going to the world economy, which is growing. And actually, the companies are growing. Right? It's just a minor crisis, nothing to be worried about, really. But at the point Sweden is no longer a small government country, it's a high-tax, generous welfare model. It's a social democratic model. Look at the job growth. Very, very, very stagnant. And here we have all the government policies going in and trying to create jobs, right? I mean, look, these are real jobs. Here, a lot of the jobs are actually, government is paying somebody to employ you. Still, you know what year Sweden recovered the jobs from the early 90s crisis? 2008, when the next crisis hit. So this is a job creation comparison of the same country during the free market era and the big welfare state era. The era of welfare dependency and the era of entrepreneurship and job creation. Now, nobody really argues against these facts and figures. They've been cited hundreds of times internationally, and I haven't seen anybody actually coming and arguing against them. What the left does is they try to neglect them or, strawman argument. But what really bothers the left is not these my calculations about economic development, because, leftists do realize, they do realize that a free market model is better at creating jobs and prosperity. They've lost that debate internationally. But they say, no. Look at social outcomes. A very popular argument in the US and in Iran and in China and in Japan is, look, we should have a Nordic-style model because then we will live longer. They say, Americans live 1.5 years longer than Danish people. Don't you want to have a big welfare state model so you live 1.5 years longer? It will increase your tax slightly, you'll live longer life. And maybe that's a fantastic trade-off. But does it make sense? Can you do the comparison? So here's just one of the figures from one of my books. I'm just looking at the lifespan of Nordic countries. The first column is 1960, when all the Nordic countries still had low-tax models, low-tax small government models, and the other one is the peak of Nordic welfare state model system. Now, Nordic people live long lives in both cases, but just look at it. Norway had the highest lifespan in the world before going towards a big welfare state, and then it's number 10 in the world after having transitioned to a big welfare state. Does this chart tell you that a big welfare state increases lifespan? Or does it tell you being a Nordic person, eating a lot of fish, taking a lot of hikes in nature, that increases lifespan? Denmark is a country which has the highest tax rate in the world. Now, they went from having the 5th to the 22nd highest lifespan. And I say, some people interpret this and say, Nima Sanandaji has proven that a big welfare state shortens your lifespan. Of course not. That's not the point. But the point is the Danish like drinking alcohol and eating fatty food. And also immigrants affect this, right? Because in the beginning, it's only land of Vikings, then you have the immigrants in the population. But regardless, it is not the big welfare state that's the cause of the social success. And I show this by other metrics also, but I think lifespan is the neatest one. And the only country to climb is actually Iceland, that climbs from number 43. This is also fascinating because, as I say when I'm interviewing the US, of course, the long lifespan of the Icelandic people is because of their pleasant climate. Right? Iceland looks like Mordor in the Lord of the Rings. It's settled by a bunch of people who were so unpopular they had to leave Norway. It's freezing cold, and cold kills you. So why? Why are the Icelandic people living so long? And of course, I'm sure your intelligent audience knows this. Iceland, I use it a lot in my writings because Iceland is a Nordic country which has had throughout history the smaller welfare state. They have a welfare state, but never as extreme as the other countries. And they are the culturally most Nordic. They are Vikings on ice. So here we see, if we focus on Nordic culture rather than Nordic social democracy, we actually have the success story. Equality then. But the left says, okay, so Nordic-style social democracy doesn't give prosperity. It doesn't actually give high, job creation. Okay, it didn't create the social outcomes of Nordic countries, but at least it creates equality, right? Well, right, to some degree. Obviously, if we tax the rich and give money, that guy looks rich, he has a Donald Trump hat on. Or maybe poor, I'm sorry, poor, you're Donald Trump on that. So if we tax the rich and give it to that guy, we are creating equality. Obviously, we're taxing the rich so they have less money, giving it to the poor. Of course, there's such an effect. But also there is a welfare dependency effect. The Nordic countries are trapping people in dependency on the government. And so, I look at the facts and figures being a researcher. It's not there. The story of how the Nordic welfare model created equality is false. It's historic revisionism. The fact is that Nordic countries became equal before they had a big government. And the reason they could implement a big government was because they were equal. Equal countries can have a big welfare state. Non-equal countries really can't. And the researchers show this. So, for example, this is one study. The high levels of income equality in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden mainly grew until 1970. Until 1970. And what happens around 68, 70 is the birth of the big welfare state model. Equality grew during the free market small tax era. Now, if you read my books, there's much more research about this. But let me just show you one slide. This slide is the countries in the world which have a small income difference. Now, of course, if you just look at it and you're not thinking, you say, look, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden. Look, Nordic countries have equal wealth division, actually income division. But let's be a little more intellectual. What is the actual pattern? What is the actual pattern? Is the pattern big welfare states have income equality? No. Small maybe, but ethnically homogeneous countries, which happen to be small, because those things correlate. As he says, homogeneous countries have equality. Slovenia has more equality than Norway. The Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, these countries are not high-tax, big welfare states. They haven't been in their history. Of course, homogeneous countries have equality because people are similar in terms of social capital, culture, education level, all of that. And look, Sweden comes after all the other Nordic countries. And if you would do today, if you measure this today, I'll promise you it has dropped. Why? Why has Sweden dropped? Why is Sweden lowest? Immigration. Why is Iceland highest? Very few immigrants. And you know what? If you read my books, one of the things is that the integration and immigration issue proves my point to be correct, unfortunately, because the immigrants to a country like Sweden, look, if the left is right and the Nordic model is creating the prosperity and income equality and the social outcomes, then it should give it to the immigrants. If I'm right, no. It's about inherent Nordic culture and also the free market institutions. In that case, no, the immigrants wouldn't get all of the good stuff, and the welfare state kind of would limit their opportunities to climb the social ladder. That is exactly what we're seeing, and that is exactly what we're seeing actually here also. But we can also turn the immigration issue and look at the immigrants from Nordic countries. So I think one of the most widely cited figures is my calculations of Nordics versus Nordic Americans. In fact, all of this began when, like 6 years ago, I wrote a column in an Intellectual American magazine, and I said, you know what, Nordic Americans are at least as prosperous and all of that as their cousins in Sweden. The day after, David Brooks, New York Times columnist, just plagiarized my column, and it went viral because syndicated throughout the world. Then I realized, wow, if he steals this idea, I should write about it. So this is the wealth of American Scandinavians compared with Americans. And what we see is that consistently, the Nordic Americans are like 50% richer than the Nordics in the Nordic. Now, Norway obviously is an exception because you're sitting on oil. But look at the figures. Norwegian Americans are even more prosperous than you guys. Can you imagine that? They don't have the oil even. And those of you, and I'm sure most of you who know history, know that overall it was the poor people who left the Nordic countries. Those who didn't have land, those who were hungry to go to America. Yet the descendants of Nordic people are much more prosperous in the US compared to their home countries. And I do this for a number of social measures like high school dropout rates, poverty. Nordic Americans have the same or much better social outcomes and 50% higher living standard than their cousins in the Nordics. I did a long interview with Forbes earlier this week about my writings, of course. I told them, look, whoever thinks that high taxes in the Nordic model doesn't reduce prosperity, just look at these figures. Nordic culture, Nordic society, Nordic human capital matters, not Nordic social democracy. So my last book was called Scandinavian Unexceptionalism. This is the more scientific book. And why unexceptionalism? Because Scandinavian exceptionalism is a big thing among the left. They say, look, these countries are exceptional. Their model is exceptional. Blah, blah, blah. We should become socialists. Okay, let's look at this. Are Nordic countries exceptional? So when Nordic countries had the highest trust levels in the world, the perhaps greatest working ethics in the world, and free markets, what did they have? Growth, prosperity, job creation. Now, is that what you would think is unusual? No. That's the free market ideal, right? That's a common sense ideal. When Nordic countries transitioned towards high taxes, they got stagnation. When Nordic countries have small welfare states, and I want to emphasize this, I know a lot of libertarians like my books, but I'm not saying a welfare state is crap. I'm not saying that. This small welfare state in Nordic countries was a highly successful institution. When, the government said, we'll give everybody education, etc. But the transition from a small, efficient welfare state to a very large one, that was the mistake, really. That's what I'm seeing in the data. So the small welfare state, coupled with free markets, low taxes, a culture of individual responsibility, a politics of individual responsibility, led to tremendous social success, whereas a massive expansion of taxes and government benefits has led to a culture of dependency. Now, for my last point, I'm going to talk about changing norms. And there's a book out there, which is, it's recommended by the Nobel laureate Verona Smith and all these hotheads. It's called Self-Control or State Control, You Decide. It's a libertarian book. You guys are libertarians, right? You should read it. It came out recently, and I wrote a part of it. I wrote a part about how a big welfare state slowly destroys the working ethics and the responsibility ethics. And my theory is that the welfare state doesn't destroy working ethics immediately. So if I change economic policies, are you going to stop working and living off the government? No, if you're not already doing that. But, your children are going to be influenced massively by this. And I summarize the research. It's very interesting. And this part is so much from Norway, actually, because you're the last guy standing with a super generous welfare state. The other guys have changed their policies. But essentially, let me just give you the Swedish data. Actually, I should have taken... In the early 80s, the Swedish people had not really adjusted to a big welfare state. And then the World Value Survey begins, and it asks Swedes, is it ever right to take use of government benefits to which you're not entitled? And of course, 82% say never can you cheat the government, because they still retain the Nordic ethics of work and responsibility. The latest survey, they asked the same question. Only 55% say it's never wrong to cheat the government. A massive shift in ethics, in norms. And I find the same thing in Norway, only that Norway was not part of the World Value Survey during the last round. But if you go back one survey, exactly the same shift. So the Nordic countries go from having very strong norms to having quite weak norms related to cheating the government. And there's a lot of research that I quote, particularly in the last book I mentioned, but also throughout my books, how the welfare state is destroying working ethics. So, for example, this study shows that the young generation is much more likely to cheat sick leave pay in Sweden. And we should remember, sick leave pay used to be very generous in Sweden. It is not. Sweden is no longer a generous welfare state. The cheating of government benefits has become so high that Sweden has stopped being a generous welfare state. In Denmark, there's a lot of evidence that a very costly and long-lasting effect of the working ethics of the Danes has been created by the welfare state. And Denmark, again, is very much moving towards the idea of a generous welfare state. The Danish Social Democrat government, which used to be in the country, had a massive discussion about we can't have this kind of welfare model. People are too much dependent on government. The Social Democrats had that discussion. And Norway, wow, there's so much research in Norway. This one is very interesting. I'm an immigrant, so I actually grew up mainly with welfare support. And I could see through my own experience, this is not a good model. People are trapped in dependency. So these guys perform a natural experiment in Norway, because in your system, sometimes that guy will say, I want a welfare check, please. And they say, you're not entitled to it. But they say, oh, come on, please, I like welfare. So a judge kind of decides, okay, should we give it? He's not entitled, but should we give it? And these guys look at the fact that some judges are good guys, they're conservatives, they say, no, you're not entitled, go home. Some of them are, social justice warriors, so they give the welfare benefits. And this is a natural experiment, so we can sort out the causal effect of being very generous. And it turns out, if you're very generous, the chances of this poor guy being stuck in welfare dependency for a long period increases, obviously, and the chances his children will become welfare dependent also increases. And this is interesting because it really proves beyond doubt that an overly generous welfare state is trapping people in welfare dependency and is actually hurting the people it's supposedly going to help. And I believe that the welfare state destruction of norms and ethics is super important. It is much more important than the detrimental effect of high taxes, because it destroys the social fabric of society. And that is what has created the shift towards lower taxes, smaller government, less generous welfare in Sweden and Denmark in particular. And that is the thing you should point to in Norway. I've been following the TV series Lilyhammer, have you? Imagine the Soprano stars comes to Norway and spends an entire TV series making fun of the big welfare state. You should look at what is he making fun of. To a large extent, this culture of dependency and, the municipality has a lot of money and people are not working hard. And what he's doing is he's showing this in a country which used to have perhaps the strongest working ethics on the planet. So I really would recommend you guys push more on that. And really look into it's my last slide. This guy, Corridon, he was the Social Democrat finance minister of Denmark. And he said, the competition state is a new welfare state. We can't have people living off government. We should have a much less generous model of handing out money, and then the government should, focus on services such as hospitals. And I really think that, in Norway, you think, oh, the state has so much oil money, we can't fight the big government. I think you can, by having a discussion about the importance of individual responsibility and working ethics. Because probably Norway has had the largest shift in the planet in terms of working norms. You guys used to be like Lithuanians and Estonians are now, working hard, and just look at you now. You're importing young Swedes because they have working ethics. Swedes have working ethics. If you believe that, then the country really has a problem. And of course, the immigration integration thing. Now, I don't know what you think about immigration integration. Maybe you libertarians are divided. But regardless, it's a terrible idea. Taking a lot of people from Somalia or whatever country, say, you know what, the government will pay you a lot of money. Become dependent on government, because you're ruining their lives. You're not helping them. So push on the issue of norms. And read my books. But even if you don't, this is the issue that is going to be the one where you can spread the free market libertarian message to a larger audience. Because people, I cite Franklin D. Roosevelt when he created the New Deal, which was in effect, this was the modern welfare state was created in America, not in Nordic countries. And he was concerned, the guy who invented the modern welfare state was concerned not about the effect it had on people paying tax, money. People don't care about the economy that much, but about how it would destroy the social fabric by creating dependency. And the reason Americans have pushed back the welfare state at least 2 or 3 times throughout their history is that people could see, wow, my neighbor has become dependent on government. That lazy guy is not working. And the compassionate say, and his children are kind of being raised in a welfare dependency trap. So this is the way forward, I think, for the Norwegian free market small government movement. Thank you.